Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And, today we're really looking at something kind of fascinating, I think, which is, what makes something newsworthy?
Yeah.
And we've got this really interesting study
Mm-hmm.
that looked at decades of nightly news broadcasts
So?
to try and figure out, like, okay, what gets covered and why,
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, we consume the news all the time.
Right.
But we don't often stop to think about, like, how do those stories actually get chosen?
Right. Yeah. It's such a black box,
Right, sure, yeah.
And this study took a really kind of unique approach, I thought.
Okay.
Instead of just like looking for bias, like, oh, is there like a left-wing bias or a right-wing bias?
Right.
They actually built a model of what they call like ideal reporting.
Okay.
So imagine like a news outlet that genuinely wants to keep the public informed, but also like knows that viewers have limited time and attention.
Oh, that's interesting.
And they can't report on everything. So they have to be really strategic about what they choose.
I see. So like a benevolent news outlet almost,
Yeah.
trying to like maximize the value of the information it delivers.
Exactly.
Since they can't cover every single thing,
Right.
they have to really prioritize.
So are you saying then that like choosing one story
Yeah.
means actively like deciding not to report on something else?
100%.
Wow.
There's always a trade-off,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Economists would call this like opportunity cost.
Okay.
We all make these kinds of choices every day, right?
Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
Deciding which articles to read,
Yeah.
which podcasts to listen to. We're always prioritizing information.
We're constantly in this like battlefield of information.
Right, exactly.
So how does this like ideal news outlet in
Yeah.
the study decide what to prioritize?
So they introduced this idea of surprise being a key factor
Okay.
in newsworthiness. And they use a measure called the Continuous Ranked Probability Score, or CRPS, to quantify it. Essentially, it measures how much a piece of news deviates from what the audience expects based on their existing knowledge.
Okay.
So the higher the surprise, the more newsworthy the event.
I see. Right. So like a stock market crash would have a much higher surprise score
Okay.
than like, a small dip in the stock market.
Yeah, it's a great example.
Okay.
It's like a surprise meter almost.
Yeah. Right.
The higher the reading, the more unexpected the news is.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm starting to see how this kind of like applies to the news we see every day. So how did the study actually apply this surprise concept to like real world news?
So they looked at several different areas,
Okay.
like the stock market, unemployment rates, even the weather,
Okay.
So
Interesting.
let's start with the stock market.
Okay.
I think we all kind of intuitively know that like big market swings grab headlines,
Right.
but smaller fluctuations don't really register.
Yeah, because we kind of expect the market to go up and down a little bit.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And the study found that this effect of surprise
Mm-hmm.
is amplified when the market is already volatile.
Oh.
So when there's like a lot of uncertainty, even a big stock market drop might not be as newsworthy.
That's pretty counterintuitive.
Yeah.
So if I'm hearing this right, in like a really volatile market, even a 10% drop might not even be front page news.
Right.
Like, what are the implications of that, do you think?
Well, it makes you wonder, how we as investors or just like everyday people trying to understand the financial world might be influenced by what doesn't get reported.
Right.
It speaks to this idea that, news isn't just about what happens,
Yeah,
but also about how that event fits into our existing understanding of the world.
totally. Yeah. It makes you think about how we perceive risk and how that might be shaped by the news we consume.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about stocks. What about unemployment?
Okay.
I'd imagine higher unemployment means more coverage.
Yeah.
Pretty straightforward, right?
It seems that way.
Yeah.
But the researchers found something a little more nuanced.
Yeah.
Reporting increases not just with the level of unemployment, but also with how much it changes from the previous month.
Okay.
So like a big jump in unemployment, even if the overall rate is still relatively low,
Mm-hmm.
would be considered more newsworthy.
Because it's more unexpected.
Exactly.
It has that higher surprise factor.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm seeing the pattern here.
Right.
Now, you mentioned that they even applied this to the weather.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious about how surprise plays into weather reports.
Well, think about it this way. Like a massive snowstorm in Los Angeles would be much more newsworthy than another sunny day.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And the study found that reporting on weather increased with higher average precipitation levels across the U.S.
Okay.
So a heavy rainfall day is more surprising
Mm-hmm.
and therefore more newsworthy, especially in typically dry areas.
So even something as seemingly mundane as the weather can be seen through this lens of surprise.
Exactly.
It's really making me think about how our expectations shape what we consider important. But what about more serious events? Did the study look at those as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
This whole idea of surprise being like a key factor in newsworthiness, it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
But what about bias?
Okay.
How did the researchers kind of use this model to investigate, potential bias in reporting?
That's a crucial question. And
Yeah.
it's one of the most insightful aspects of this study.
Yeah.
I think they used their model to look for two specific types of bias:
Okay.
realization bias and domain bias.
Okay. Let's break those down a little bit.
Sure.
What exactly do those biases mean in the context of news reporting?
So think of realization bias
Yep.
as a tendency to favor reporting on certain types of outcomes.
Okay.
For example, there's often a perception that news outlets focus more on negative economic news, even when there are equally significant positive developments.
So it's like that saying, bad news sells.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the researchers looked at unemployment data specifically
Yep.
to test for this type of bias. Initially, their analysis did suggest that reports were more likely to focus on rising unemployment, even if the decreases were of the same magnitude.
So it seemed like there was a bias towards reporting the negative side of things.
Right.
But how does the concept of surprise come into play here?
Well, remember how unemployment tends to rise faster than it falls.
Right.
That means those big jumps in unemployment are inherently more surprising according to the CRPS measure.
Okay.
And when the researchers controlled for this surprise factor, the apparent bias towards reporting negative unemployment news largely vanished.
So it wasn't necessarily that news outlets were intentionally highlighting the bad news. It's just that those big increases were genuinely more newsworthy.
Exactly.
Because they were more unexpected and deviated further from the norm.
Right.
That's a really important distinction, isn't it?
It is. It highlights the danger of jumping to conclusions about bias without considering the full context. The surprise factor, as measured by CRPS, helps us kind of disentangle the inherent newsworthiness of an event from potential biases in reporting.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
What about domain bias, the second type of bias they investigated?
Right. So that's when a news outlet might favor certain topics over others, even if the surprise levels are similar.
Okay.
The researchers use coverage of U.S. military casualties in Iraq versus Afghanistan
Interesting.
to test for this type of bias.
That's interesting. There was a perception at the time that news coverage focused more on the war in Iraq.
Right.
Did this study find evidence of this?
Their initial findings did show a difference, with casualties in Iraq being more likely to be reported compared to those in Afghanistan.
So the data seemed to support the idea that there was a bias towards reporting on Iraq. But I have a feeling this is where the surprise factor comes in again.
You're catching on.
Okay.
Once they factored in the difference in surprise levels between casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan, the apparent bias completely disappeared.
It seems like there's a pattern emerging here.
Right.
So even though it initially looked like there was preferential treatment for Iraq, it was actually because those casualties were inherently more surprising, more unexpected, and therefore more newsworthy, according to the CRPS model.
Precisely.
Okay.
Casualties in Iraq were simply more variable and less predictable, leading to a higher average CRPS. This difference in surprise, rather than any inherent bias towards Iraq, explains the disparity in reporting.
This is making me rethink my whole understanding of how news is presented. It's like we often focus on what's being reported without considering the why behind those choices.
Right. It underscores the value of critical thinking and looking beyond the surface.
Yeah.
This study provides a new lens through which to view news selection, one that takes into account not just the content of the news, but also the element of surprise and how it influences our perception of what's important.
This has been an incredibly eye-opening conversation we've learned about this fascinating model of ideal reporting, explored how surprise plays a key role in determining newsworthiness,
Yeah.
and even touched on the complex issue of bias in reporting.
And there's still more to uncover.
Oh, really?
We've only just begun to explore the implications of this research and what it means for us as news consumers.
Hey, Tune listeners, we'll be back with the final part of our deep dive into newsworthiness in just a moment.
Welcome back, everyone. We've been on quite a journey, haven't we?
Yeah, it has been a deep dive for sure.
Exploring this research on newsworthiness and how something called surprise plays a bigger role than we might think.
Yeah, we've seen how this surprise factor measured by that thing we were talking about, the continuous rank probability score, the CRPS,
Right?
can really challenge our assumptions about why certain news gets covered,
Right.
and even shed light on potential biases in reporting.
So much of what we've discussed Just makes intuitive sense, like our natural tendency to gravitate towards the unexpected.
Right. It's like our brains are hardwired to seek out novelty, you know?
It really is, and this study gives us a way to understand that intuition,
Right.
offering like a framework for analyzing news selection through this lens of surprise.
Yeah, I'm thinking back on all of this, and it just makes me wonder, like, what news stories have really stuck with you lately?
Hmm.
Like, what grabbed your attention, and why was it the unexpectedness, the impact, or maybe a combination of both?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's a good question for all of us to consider.
Yeah.
It encourages us to be more mindful of our own news consumption habits
Right.
and how our expectations shape what we deem important.
Now, before we wrap up, I have one more question that's been nagging at me.
Okay.
Is this CRPS thing only applicable to news, or can it be used in other areas?
That's a fantastic question, and the answer is that it has a wide range of applications.
Oh, wow.
CRPS is used in forecasting scientific research, even in understanding our own cognitive biases.
That's amazing. Who knew that a deep dive into what makes something newsworthy could open up a whole new world of thinking about information expectations and how we interpret the world around us?
Yeah, it's a good reminder that there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, and that sometimes the most fascinating discoveries lie in the unexpected connections between seemingly disparate fields.
Couldn't have said it better myself. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this insightful research, and to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of newsworthiness. We'll catch you on our next adventure into the realm of knowledge.